Well, hello, everybody. I'm afraid we seem to have a bit of a technical hitch linking up with Michael. It worked well yesterday, but today we have a gremlin. However, welcome to the 16th series of the Hexham Debates. They began in 2007, and among our first programme was today's speaker, who encouraged us to keep going. Michael, you've been a great supporter of the Hexham Debates, and we're very grateful to you for coming in yet again. We're also grateful to Peter Woods, whose technical skills are being tested to breaking point today. If you have any questions as Michael's talk rolls on, please put them in the chat box and we'll deal with them at the end of Michael's half hour. Professor Michael Clarke is a distinguished commentator on defence and security matters. His short biography is included on the Hexham Debates website. Currently, he's Associate Director of the Strategy and Security Institute at Exeter University. Michael will speak for about 30 minutes, and then he'll take your questions for another half an hour. Professor Clarke, we're delighted to welcome you again to the Hexham Debates.
Caroline, thank you very much. Peter will wave at me if something's going wrong here in my voice. And I'm sorry that I can't be on camera. There's something gone wrong. It's a problem at my end. The camera's gone wrong here. However, there is some advantage in that, because I had a minor accident last week and banged my face on the pavement. So I'm all a bit bashed up at the moment with black eyes and bruises and so on. So it's probably just as well that you've only got the PowerPoint to look at. But it's always a pleasure to speak to Hexham, and my congratulations. This goes on and on, year after year, and it's a terrific organization that produces some very interesting lectures, I know, and really good debate. And I'm endlessly impressed by what is done in this forum of what I call the Hexham Debates. So I was asked to talk about the Ukraine war and just offer an analysis really as to why it's a global security issue. Why isn't it just a war in Europe, very unpleasant, but a European war? And I would argue it's a global security issue for a number of reasons. So let's just sort of go through it. First of all, it's Putin's war. We call him Vladimir the Indefinite now because he's fixed the constitution so that he could stay in power, if he chose to, until 2036. He turned 70 this year, so you can work that out for yourself. But he has an open-ended ticket to power, so he will only finish in one of three ways, I suppose. I mean, one is that he may be removed, and I think that's the most likely, and that could happen very quickly. It could happen in the next 3 months, or it might be the next 3 or 4 years. But I think it's most likely he will be removed because this war is a disaster for Russia, which is only going to get worse, in my view. Second possibility is that he becomes ill and incapable of ruling, and therefore he is eased out, or there's some sort of effective regency that preserves his dignity. Or the third is that he just dies in office, the way Stalin did in March 1953. But he's certainly not going to hand over power, and he's not going to lose this war gracefully, but he is going to lose it, is in my view. And so it's a global security issue for a number of reasons. The first reason is that it's a global security issue is issues about Russia. I mean, this is a map of the regions of Russia, and it just gives a sense of how big the country is and how many regions there are and how different those regions are. It spans a continent. It goes onto the Arctic. It's Asian. It's European. It's Central Asian. It's got 4 borders, all of which are very, very different. And here is a country now of 144 million people, which is, and the population of Western Europe is more than 3.5 times bigger than that. The GDP of Western Europe is more than 12 times bigger than the GDP of Russia. But this huge country, whose GDP is about 2/3 that of Britain, it's about equivalent to that of Italy at the moment, nevertheless has more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world stationed within it, and mostly kept up to date. Unlike most of its other weapon systems, its nuclear systems are all very modernized. So it's a very big country with lots of regions, and you would expect there to be lots of regions, including these very big regions in the east. But there's a view of Russia in its ethnicity. And of course, there's a lot of, the Russians in it are very important, but look at how many other nationalities there are. And that includes religions as well, Eastern Orthodox religion, plus some of the more Asiatic leaning versions of that, and some outright, and a lot of Buddhism in the East, and then in the Southwest, a lot of a big Muslim population. And the point about all of this is that the history of Russia is a very interesting history, and it starts with the Kievi Rus, who are the peoples who begin to develop a homeland in the 11th and 12th centuries. Before that, of course, it had all been based on Kiev. The Prince of Kiev in the 9th and 10th centuries was the most important princedom. Kiev, the city, was founded in the year 482. So it celebrated its 1500th anniversary in 1982. Kiev is much older than Moscow. So the development of Russia went from Kiev to Novgorod, great trading port, and then to Moscow, and then to Petersburg. But what this tells us, and I'm not going to try and give any lectures on Russian history, nor am I really qualified to, but what this tells us is that, first of all, Russia is an internal empire. It has always been an empire which has, by and large, been created by conquest internally, as well as a certain amount of external conquest. And secondly, it always therefore fears the problem of fragmentation, and Russianness within this internal empire is always a matter of some controversy and some sensitivity. And then thirdly, Russia has always been united under autocracies. Democracy in the Western sense really hasn't worked in Russia at any time, and there's not been very much of an experiment with it. And the Russians themselves are really interested in strong leadership, a leadership that they can trust, and a leadership which actually keeps the country together and stops them having to doubt their existence as a country. So, I mean, Russia itself has a different psychological background to many other countries in Europe. Certainly, it developed differently, and it's such a huge country with so many unique developments, so many unique elements that we have to realize that it operates on different sorts of principles. And it's interesting, both in the Tsarist period and now with Putin, when things are bad, the Russians don't tend to blame the leader. They blame the administrator. I mean, look at the place of Gogol, for instance, the government inspector, places like that. Everyone blames the local administrators. When things were bad in 1905, people went to the Winter Palace, not to storm it as such, but to appeal originally, first of all, to the Tsar, to say, look, if the Tsar knew about this, he'd do something about it. He'd stop it happening, if only the Tsar knew. And it's a bit the same with Putin. A lot of people don't really blame Putin for what's going wrong in the war. They say it's the military's fault. What's wrong with them? And if Putin, why doesn't Putin get hold of them? They don't blame Putin for this. They blame the administrators. There is a sense that the Russians, unlike European liberal Democrats, don't really go to the top when they look for blame. They assume that the top is their benign leader, and they will go with it for a long time. So anyway, there's some general points, I think, about Russia as a different sort of actor in world politics. And then there's Putin. There's Putin's view of Russia. Now, this is a map of Russia with all of the other colored bits when it was the Soviet Union. And in 1991, Putin was sitting in Dresden as the KGB head. I mean, he wasn't even the KGB head in East Germany. He was in a sort of a small town, small city, Dresden, where he was just a local KGB chief. And he was appalled by what he saw in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up, because the Soviet Union broke up into 15 different pieces. And so there was Russia and another 14 territories that all became independent. And so those territories, going anti-clockwise from the top, as it were, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, up in the Baltics there, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, that little green spot on the western Moldova, very poorest country in Europe at the moment, then round to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then the stands of Kazakhstan's the biggest, of course, and then the other stands, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and so on. 15 different states were created, and Putin regarded this as a catastrophe, that the greatness of the Soviet Union, the greatness of the Russian-led Soviet Union, would be dismembered like this. And he said many times, this is a catastrophe. This is a historical injustice. And so he has this sense which builds on that sort of Russian almost paranoia about the sort of country it is and what it represents. That country being somehow reduced by a crime of history, as I think he would have seen it. And so think of that big pink Russia in the middle. Think of that as the Russia that we were mentioning a moment ago. Think of Russia as that, and then transpose that onto all of the areas that the Soviet Union, as it were, fragmented into. And you can see the sense of bewilderment that and powerlessness that the Russians felt in the early 2000s. And Putin comes to power, remember, in 1999, and then things start to change in the 2010s and then the 2020s. It goes through the early 2000s and then the 2010s. And so Putin has been in power now for 24 years, 1999 through till 2023. This is his 24th year in power. And you can see the way his thinking and his policy has developed in that time. And in addition to this historical crime, as he sees it, in breaking up the Soviet Union, he's faced with this as well. And this is NATO. And on the left is a map of NATO that we all were used to for years and years, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. That's the map as it existed in about 1982. And there were 12 original members of NATO, and those 12 then were extended to 15, then 16, and it stayed at 16 for many years. And NATO began in 1949. And so there was a clear map where the blue and the red, you could see where the inner German border was, where the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, ran from the Baltic right through. There's Yugoslavia in the grey there, independent Yugoslavia and independent other neutral countries, Switzerland, Austria, right through to the borders of Greece. And there's that little red blob there. Down on the bottom left is Albania, which allied itself with China during these years. But that was a pretty clear demarcation. Now look at the map on the right. NATO has enlarged itself 10 times since 1945, and it's gone from the original 12 members to 32 members in 22-23. I'm including here Finland and Sweden. And I've drawn a black line as a sort of borderline now between NATO and the other countries. And Putin is acutely aware of that line, because not only is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on the NATO side of the line, but that line is now 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow than it was, 1,000 miles. And Putin thinks in very territorial terms. He always sees security as territory, just like Stalin did. It's all about having buffers and territory. And he sees that the as it were, the possibility of NATO military force is 1,000 miles nearer to him than it was. And also, of those 10 enlargements, the last 6 of them have been while he personally has been sitting in Moscow. So he's lived through 6 enlargements while he's been leader of Russia. And that has enraged him in all sorts of ways, and it makes him feel very insecure. Now, the other thing I should say about this, well, two things really. One is that none of these enlargements have been at NATO's behest, as it were. NATO has never wanted to enlarge. NATO is very comfortable, as of the 1982 map, with 16 members, because that was militarily pretty significant, and that was a grouping that they could hold together. NATO at 32 is much harder to hold together politically, and in every case from 1982 onwards, NATO has, as it were, privately, reluctantly enlarged because everybody wants to get into NATO. It's always been a dilemma. Well, is it going to make life more difficult and so on? The 2 countries that now make a difference is the enlargement, which is going to take place later this year at some point, which is Finland and Sweden. That's fundamental. And again, it shows the basis of this war, that Sweden has been neutral since 1812. And Finland has been neutral since 1945. And yet within months of this war, they asked to join NATO. And those 2 are militarily significant. They are militarily significant. They are the most important enlargement of NATO from a military point of view since German rearmament in 1955. All right, that's important. I mean, nobody else who's coming to NATO, with the possible exception of Poland. Poland's quite a big country, but none of the others, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, they add very, very little to NATO's military might, as it were, and they produce far more problems than they do benefits. And the last couple of members that joined was Montenegro, and then the military might of North Macedonia. And so, Montenegro joined in 2017 and North Macedonia joined in 2020, tiny statelets that just give NATO more headaches and add absolutely nothing. And that's the way it's been for NATO. NATO, for political reasons, has felt it needs to respond to these requests that people join, but it hasn't wanted to. Nevertheless, it has. The other thing that's worth saying about NATO enlargement, just as against the Russian interpretation, is that the Russians make a great deal of this idea that the West promised never to move towards the East. And that was actually never the case, though NATO didn't do enough to establish that was never the case. They always go back to this phrase, not 1 inch. They said, you promised us, you said that NATO would not move 1 inch further militarily with the unity of Germany. After the Berlin Wall came down. You promised us. Well, no, they didn't. It was a phrase that you used by Baker, the American Secretary of State, to his Russian counterpart. And he said, hypothetically, when they were talking about it, they said, how would you feel if we made a commitment to move not 1 inch over the inner German border militarily? How would that play with you? And he left him, went to bed. That was the way it was. And that phrase, not 1 inch, somehow got into all of the Russian documents. It doesn't exist anywhere in an American document or a NATO document. It's just in a couple of memoirs about Baker, but it's never been developed as an idea. But the Russians held on to this as a promise that NATO made in 1989 that if Germany was united, they would not move 1 inch further eastwards in military terms. Now, having said all of that, NATO has been pretty cavalier in the way it has enlarged and some of the statements it made. And the big mistake was the Bush administration. And in 2008, the Americans under Bush, who was remarkably inept. I mean, everything else you say about George Bush, he was, Trump set new standards. But I mean, Bush was an extraordinarily foolish president with a foolish administration around him. And in world politics terms, I can't think of a more foolish American president than him over 2 terms. Anyway, but the Bush administration in 2008 pushed NATO to say to Ukraine and Georgia, we will eventually look forward to welcoming you into NATO. That was a really, really, really stupid thing to say. And of course, it feeds all of this Russian paranoia, in effect. It actually gives justification for some of the paranoia that Russia feels. So, I mean, I offer that as background. And then let's get to where we are now. Thinking about Europe now, we all thought that Russia under Putin was, to use a colloquialism, we just thought it was a bloody nuisance. But it would be no more than a bloody nuisance. It would dabble in Western elections, which it did. It would try and undermine our economies. It would try and steal our intellectual property and so on. And it would dabble in other countries in Europe, and it would try and manipulate events, which indeed it did. And so under Putin, Russia was always trying to bully the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. He was bullying the Poles. He was always trying to frighten Germany. And then he was conducting a sort of charm offensive towards Romania and Hungary. He was meddling in the Western Balkans, tried to organize a couple of assassinations, which didn't work, and then involved himself in the Syrian civil war and got bases, an air base and a naval base, air base at Latakia and a naval base at Tartus in Syria. Played games in Cyprus, owns most of Cyprus now. Got involved with the warlords in Libya, Haftar, and then became involved in northern Niger and now in Mali using the Wagner group. And so everyone thought, this is Putin just playing games. I mean, playing the cards that he thinks are in his hand to frustrate as much as he can and build up Russia's influence. And over Ukraine, the view always was that, well, what he's doing in Ukraine, he's trying to threaten Ukraine. And you can see there on that map what a big state Ukraine is. 44 million people. Russia is 144 million. Ukraine is 44 million people. It's the biggest state in Europe in terms of area, apart from Russia itself. And it's a very big country. And he was always, as it were, threatening Ukraine. In 2021, the Russians went in for big maneuvers, military maneuvers on the borders of Ukraine. And people said, you're not seriously thinking of invading, are you? And those military maneuvers then were stood down. 2022, he began the same thing, these military maneuvers, and they were bigger this time. We said, oh, okay, we've seen this before. This is a lot of threatening. What are you going to do? There's obviously a price for this. You're going to try and get concessions or threaten to invade. Well, we don't really believe you're going to invade. And so the general belief was that this is this is more saber rattling, and this is Putin still playing the European game, but he won't cross a threshold because it would be such a foolish thing to do to try to invade Ukraine. But here we are. On the 24th of February, he crossed the line, a big threshold. And we thought, looking at this map, when we thought, well, look, supposing he does do something, what are the two things he might do? So, well, okay, if they cross a line and use these troops that they've been exercising with in December, January, and early February last year, maybe they'll move into the Donbass area around Luhansk and Donetsk there on the eastern borders. Maybe they'll move troops into there and consolidate instead of using their militias and their troops out of uniform, which is what they have been doing. Maybe they'll just try and consolidate and build up more strength there. Maybe they'll try and push a bit. They might even, would they dare to push against Mariupol, which is, independence, only a few miles away from the border that had been established with the Donetsk People's Republic, self-declared republic. Would they try and put pressure on Mariupol, try a bit of subversion? We thought that was the most likely, if anything. And secondly, they thought, would he be reckless enough to try to produce this land bridge? So pushing out from the Donbass westwards, would he dare to go as far as Crimea and try and create a solid land bridge of occupied territory all the way to Crimea? Would he dare do that? That would be a huge thing to do. And I remember I sat in meetings with one of the heads of the intelligence services and a couple of previous heads of the intelligence services, and they said, well, you can't rule anything out, but it would be such a big thing to do. Surely they're not likely. Well, come the 24th of February, he went for broke, tried to invade the whole country. So an invasion from the north, from Belarus, to try to take Kiev, moving in from Western Russia to try to get the cities. Kharkiv is marked there, the second city, but there was the other cities like Sumy in the north and Chernihiv, and they tried to take the cities. And then not just to take a bit of a land bridge, to push all the way westwards. The attempt for certain was to push to Odessa, take the whole of the southern coast, and effectively landlock Ukraine from the Black Sea. So it'd be a landlocked country, which is, the second biggest grain producer in the world, third, fourth biggest fertilizer producer, and therefore have a complete lock over Ukraine's ability to export the stuff that it needed to export. And so that's the invasion that actually took place, and we couldn't believe it. It was, and we were all not taken by surprise that by then that there was going to be a military move. And the thing that convinced me that there'd be a military move was relatively late on, around about 2 weeks before, I think, when I found out that they were bringing medical services to the exercises, which was relatively unusual, but then that they were bringing blood supplies to the medical services in the exercises. And you don't bring blood supplies to an exercise unless you intend to do some fighting. So that convinced me that they were preparing for something. But like everybody else, I was more than surprised that this was an invasion intended to go for broke, because it was a foolish thing to do with 190,000 troops to invade the second biggest land area in Europe, a country of 44 million people who were clearly determined to resist. They weren't going to roll over, and they weren't going to welcome the Russians in. And anyone who knew anything about Ukraine after 2014, after the Crimea crisis of 2014, would have known that. And it was astonishing that Putin seemed to think differently. And that's still one of the great mysteries of all of this. And so here we are now, and this is the battle situation as of about a week ago. And so that sort of big semicircle of fighting, the two light blue areas are the two areas that the Ukrainians have now taken back. In the north, the Kharkiv Oblast, Kharkiv region, and they're pushing now on the borders of, and they're fighting in, see that where it says Luhansk, they're fighting, ferocious battles at Kreminna and Svatove, and they are trying to break into Russian forces and get behind them further south in the Donbass, in Donetsk. And then the other area, the light blue area down in the southwest, is all the area west of the Dnieper River. So they pushed against Kherson, which is the fifth city of Ukraine, the only big city that the Russians really occupied, and they pushed them out west of the Dnieper River, and the Russians have now dug in pretty solid defenses all the way along the river there, and that might be the next area for a push. By and large, lots of things are happening locally, but by and large, the Russians are digging in very solidly, and the Ukrainians are continuing to push during the winter while they can. But where this war is going is towards much more fighting after the winter, in the spring, and we don't know when the spring will be. We're more than halfway through the winter now. But in the spring, the Russians will be arriving with something upwards of 200,000 new troops, and the Ukrainians are trying to re-equip and reorganize their forces. The Ukrainians have got, I think in reality, the Ukrainians have got a force of about 700,000 now, which includes their previous army, which was 350,000, and it had some experience fighting in the Donbass, plus all the volunteers they've got, and they can go up to 1 million. I mean, as I say, it's a big country, 44 million people. The Russians began with a very small army, actually, 280,000 in their standing peacetime army, and they mobilized 190 of that 280,000 for this invasion, and they've now remobilized 300,000 people, of whom about 200,000, by my calculations, are being allocated into new units. Shoigu, the defense minister, announced last week a whole series of reforms, and it looks as if they are trying to create about seven new divisions and upgrading 5 brigades to divisions. So it looks as if they're trying to create about 12 new divisional formations of about 15,000 troops. Divisions are usually about 15,000 troops, and then some extra particular forces for the regions and for Moscow and Petersburg. I mean, it looks to me as if they're allocating about 220 to 230,000 troops towards these new formations, which is what you would expect them to have. Now, they won't all turn up in Ukraine at once, but the Russians are certainly preparing a big push at the end of the winter, and the Ukrainians are trying to get ready for that, and might even have their own offensive, which they might go early. I mean, if they could, I'm sure they would, to open up a new area of offensive action. And my guess would be, if they do, it would be from Zaporizhia. You see Zaporizhia there, just on the map, in the Zaporizhia Oblast, just north of the land bridge, and pushing from Zaporizhia down to, you see that little blue hatched circle where there is partisan activity taking place, according to the map. Well, that's Melitopol. And I think if the Ukrainians could, they'd push from Zaporizhia to Melitopol onto the coast and split the Russian land bridge in two. And that would give the Russians a real problem, if they could. And it would also put a lot of pressure on Crimea. And again, that would be politically quite important. So we're looking at nothing but renewed fighting. And I think the fighting to come will be more intense, more risky for us, for the Western world. Escalation is built into this crisis. And there is nothing to talk about politically until that next round of fighting has worked its way through and everyone's settled, or it'll create a new reality on the ground. And out of that new reality will come any political ideas that may flow from that. So where are we then in terms of the rest of the world? Well, a couple of things. The man on the top right is Dvornikov. He was the commander for a fair bit of this operation. He was replaced in October. And Dvornikov was responsible, as far as any one single person is responsible, down the bottom left, for all of the war crimes, which have been a daily occurrence all throughout the war itself. The man on the top left is Surovikin, or Sorovikin, in Russian pronunciation. He's actually an Air Force general, as you can see, but he's a joint forces man. And Sorovikin became he replaced Dvornikov. Dvornikov instantly had a drink problem. Surovikin just has a sort of empathy problem, I think. And Surovikin replaced him on the 10th of October. And Surovikin has given Russian strategy in Ukraine at least a coherence. And that coherence is based on withdrawing Russian troops from areas where they can't win, get them into safer areas, get them out of range of the longer range Ukrainian artillery, and dig in and prepare for a new offensive. And while he's doing that, the Russians are bombing this critical national infrastructure. They're trying to give the Ukrainians as miserable a winter as they possibly can. And the bottom right there is the bombing of Dnipro last week, which was that was created by an anti-ship missile, 6 tons worth of missile, and warhead 4 times bigger than most missiles. Almost certainly it missed. It was actually almost certainly aiming at the power station about 1.5 miles away on the other side of the river. But they're very, very inaccurate, these things. They go back to the 1960s. So surprise, surprise, it hit an apartment block and killed a lot of people. So Surovikin does have coherence to the strategy, but it's very clear now. They're not trying to remove the leadership from Kiev. They're not trying to just, as it were, make Ukraine come to the negotiating table. This is a war on Ukraine, the country, the whole country. And Surovikin is famous for doing this in Syria. In 2016 in Idlib, under his direction, the Syrians bombed 24 hospitals before they even began their offensive. They bomb the hospitals first, and then that makes life even harder for everybody when they come to stand up to an offensive, and makes civilians demand that the whole thing stops. And so what this more coherent strategy has done between Dvornikov and Surovikin is actually spread the implications of the war. So that this war is now spreading to Moldova. Tiny little Moldova is now suffering power outages because it's part of the same old Soviet system. And the Moldovans are very, very worried by what's going to happen. I think Moldova will be lucky to survive this war, even if Ukraine does. There's created problems in the Baltic. In the Baltic Sea, pipelines have been blown up. Certainly, I'm certain, by the Russians. They've tried to frighten people by blowing up the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines. In the Black Sea, by restricting access to the Black Sea, which is a major trading area for the whole world. And in the Western Balkans, encouraging Serbia to launch another attack a la 1992 on Bosnia, to take a piece of Bosnia again, the way they tried to then, and probably to try to get Kosovo back, which declared independence and has been recognized by most countries, but probably to try to create a crisis with Kosovo to produce some sort of political change there. And so where this leaves Europe is that it is, in a sense, Europe is struggling to contain the other effects, the regional effects of this war. The war itself is bad enough in Ukraine, but the other effects in the Baltic, in Moldova, in the Western Balkans, and the implications of this in the Black Sea are pretty important. And that's just as an example of the pipelines that the Russians now can't use. And this is the other side of the equation. This is a disaster for Russia. The Nord Stream 1 up there and the Nord Stream 2, they're gone, finished. The Yamal pipeline is still delivering a little bit of gas, but it won't soon. The Brotherhood pipeline is delivering more because it's Hungary is getting stuff from the southern pipeline and will continue to do so for as long as Orban is in power. And then Turkey is playing a sort of trying to keep a foot in both camps, and Blue Stream and the pipeline to come Turk Stream might be important. But effectively, Russia has lost the European market for gas, and it will take years to send that gas to Asian markets because they've got to build the pipelines for them. And they're already selling gas at knockdown prices because the people who are taking the gas, India and China, know that they've got Russia, in a sense, over a barrel, and they're demanding very cut prices for it. And so the price of the wholesale price of gas has plummeted, although you don't feel that in our domestic bills, but it has. There's reasons for that. But it has plummeted, and the price of oil is going down. The point is that because this war is a disaster for Russia, that has knock-on effects to everything else, quite apart from what it does in Ukraine. And the final point I would make, by way of the globalization of this crisis, is the rest of the world. This is the UN General Assembly vote on the 2nd of March. The General Assembly had a very strong resolution, which said that it deplored the invasion. That was the phrase it used, deploring the invasion and demanding an immediate withdrawal and restoration of the territories which were then being conquered by Russian forces. And that was the result of the vote. 141 states voted in favor of that resolution. 5 voted against, and the 5 who voted against were Russia, Belarus, as you would expect, North Korea, as you'd expect, So 5 basket cases voted against it. But look, 35 nations abstained. And those who abstained included China, India, Pakistan, South Africa, many others. Effectively, if you look at the sort of 5 plus 35, you've got 40 states did not agree with the resolution, and 141 states did agree with the resolution. But among those 30 states who agreed or would not condemn Russia, among those 40 states were more than half of the world's population. And this is the truth of it, that the rest of the world is standing back to see. Israel, for instance, although it voted in this case, it was in 141, Israel is standing back. You know, they're watching genocide take place. Genocide doesn't seem to bother them as long as it's somewhere else. South Africa is standing back, is now hosting Russian ship visits at the moment. Astonishing. India and China are doing more trade with Russia than they've done before. And, you know, Modi in India talks endlessly about the evils of imperialism, but Russian imperialism doesn't seem to bother him. It's very disheartening for Western liberals, and it shows that what is at stake, and this is my conclusion really, what is at stake here is the whole sort of what they call the rules-based international order, rather pompous term, but we're talking here about the Western liberal world order, which for all its imperfections has created a degree of stability and is based on at least a recognition of international law. For European security, this is a major crisis because the Russian rhetoric has increased all the time. And so for the Russians, this is all about pushing back against NATO, pushing back against American dominance of Europe, pushing back against what they call American imperialism and European Nazism. They say it's European fascism is on the rise. And they've been saying that not just now, but for the last 10 or 12 years. It's not true, but it's what they say, and it's what they've convinced the Russian public of. And so for Europe, this really matters to the future stability of Europe. And of course, for Ukraine, this is a fight for survival. And everywhere that Russian forces have occupied in Ukraine, whether it's Kherson or Melitopol or Mariupol, there is my phrase, and I think there's a great deal of evidence for this now, a dark Gestapo night has descended on those communities. The Rosgvardia, the internal police, 400,000 of them. The Rosgvardia are there in, not 400,000, that's the total number of the Rosgvardia, but the Rosgvardia are there in high numbers, and they are doing what the Gestapo used to do, to snuff out any Ukrainian nationalism. I mean, school books are being rewritten, etc., etc. You can imagine there's a whole list of things. And I describe that as a dark Gestapo night, which has descended on occupied areas of Ukraine. And that in itself means that this is a war that the West cannot afford to see Russia win. And we're not saying the West has got to win, but we're saying the West has got to prevail so that Putin's adventure is seen to fail, and that Putin himself and Russia pays a price for it. Only then will the rest of the world, as it were, think again about standing back and regarding it as somehow not their problem. So I will stop there and take questions as and when you want to ask them.
Oh, thank you, Michael. That was a whistle-stop tour around this huge, sprawling problem. If our listeners can type into the chat box their questions, we can flick them onto the screen. There's one that's come through saying thank you, but not a question yet. I'm wondering, Michael, in the absence of a question on the screen, if you'd like to comment on whether Russia's involvement in Ukraine has affected their presence in other countries, like Syria, for instance.
Yes, a very interesting point, actually, Caroline. The Russia is because it's pulling all the stops out now, and it's trying everything it can to diminish Western behavior and Western opposition. And if it's destabilizing lots of other places, or trying to, through cyber means and subversion, as well as economic manipulation, which is in a sense allowed. You can play games with economics and pricing. Everybody else does. That's not so illegitimate, but they do it by both legitimate and illegitimate means. And the areas that Europe is worrying about are the Baltic states, the Baltic Sea, the Western Balkans that I mentioned, very important. But there are also, this may turn back on Russia in all sorts of other ways. The Russians themselves may be struggling in Georgia, and if you look at if you look at that map, just down in the south, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. The Russians have got two big issues in Georgia. They have had since before 2008. We'll go back to 1991, really. In Abkhazia and South Ossetia, got two breakaway republics, and that belong to Georgia, but they are breakaways. Russians have had to withdraw their troops from Abkhazia and South Ossetia and send them to Ukraine. And the Georgians are becoming much more assertive. And it may well be that a crisis for Russia, a new crisis, will arise in Georgia that they may not be able to do very much about. Similarly, in the same area, talking about into the Caucasus here, Armenia and Azerbaijan. Russia is backing Armenia very strongly. Azerbaijan is very independent and is taking a lot of aid from Turkey, trying to get back Nagorno-Karabakh. And Nagorno-Karabakh, again, is an area that Armenia invaded on behalf of its ethnic nationals, it said, and Russia backed it. And now the Azerbaijanis look as if they're getting back parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, and they're prepared to attack Russian forces, and they have done quite successfully. And they may well create a crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh. Equally, Kazakhstan, huge Kazakhstan. They won't help the Russians. President Tokayev in Kazakhstan, he owes Putin. In January last year, Putin saved his bacon when there were big demonstrations in Kazakhstan. Putin sent Russian paratroopers in to suppress it, which they did quite quickly. And Tokayev owes Putin, but he won't help him. And indeed, they are, the Kazakhs look as if they're leaning the other way. And I think Putin is losing influence. And even Belarus, in Belarus, there's a lot of discussion now, which is just to the north of Ukraine. Will Belarus be part of the new offensive? It almost certainly won't, although it will allow its territory to be used as it has done. But the Belarusian army is really very small and is only really designed to suppress the population in Belarus. But funnily enough, there are already Belarusian soldiers fighting in Ukraine for the Ukrainians. There are two battalions of Belarusian volunteers fighting for Ukraine. Ukraine is actually pretty popular amongst the people of Belarus. And so, again, Putin is losing influence, even though Lukashenko in Belarus needs Putin. If Putin collapses tomorrow, Lukashenko goes the day after. I'm certain about that. So Lukashenko is completely dependent on Putin. But Belarus itself is leaning further and further away from Moscow. And Lukashenko is literally like a man, with one foot on the boat and one foot on the quayside. As the boat begins to leave the quayside, he can't stretch too much further, and we'll see what happens there. So, yes, a lot of territorial instability, both in Russia's favor and against Russia, seems now likely to happen. And my guess is that some of that will become clear during this year.
Okay, well, there's questions are coming in, Michael. If you could perhaps give us slightly briefer answers, we can cover more ground.
Yeah.
So can you see the one from Johnny? What I haven't heard is whether it'd be an option for America to send their older tanks like the M60 if the stock is available, or would that even be practical?
Yeah, not so practical. And the thing about the M60 is that it's more or less on a par with the tanks that the Russians are operating, the T-72, T-80s, T-90s. The things that make the difference are that the three big battle tanks in the world are the American Abrams M1A1, the Challenger 2, and the Leopard 2, the German Leopard 2. You might also include the French Leclerc tank just about in that group, but they are the premier tanks. And the point is they're faster and bigger and heavier and more lethal than anything the Russians have got. And so the M60s, even if you could send 200 of them, wouldn't be as decisive as 50 or 60 M1 Abrams or more Challenger 2s and preferably Leopard 2s, because these big premier battle tanks really are they are pretty decisive if they're used properly on the battlefield.
Okay, the next question from David. What do you think are Putin's views regarding Kaliningrad? Will he push, possibly militarily, for a viable land corridor to connect that ice-free port to Russia?
Yeah, we looked at this. I mean, NATO's been thinking about this for years. The Suwalki corridor. I mean, Lithuania. If you look at you look at Poland, the green Poland. Look north of Poland. That little yellow, little spot of yellow is Kaliningrad, and between that little yellow spot, Kaliningrad, and Belarus, that quite a short distance is the Suwalki corridor, and the idea would be, would it be possible that Russia might sort of push that corridor to unite Kaliningrad with the rest of Russia? Well, in a major war against Europe, that might be plausible, but the opposite is much more likely now to be true, given what I was saying about Belarus a moment ago. Kaliningrad if it's cut off now. I mean, it's cut off by land because Lithuania now won't let the Russians transit any war stocks or anything related to war stocks through to Kaliningrad. And so Kaliningrad can now only be supplied by sea, which it is being. So Kaliningrad itself is very, very vulnerable. If Putin ever tried to, as it were, move into NATO territory, then Kaliningrad is one of the places he really wouldn't be able to defend. It's any military person would say that's unsustainable where it is surrounded by NATO countries and the Baltic Sea that NATO has real dominance in, particularly when Sweden and Finland become members of NATO. Just look at them.
Okay, can we move now to the threat of nuclear war? There's a question on the screen. The fear of a nuclear war now seems legitimate. What's the likelihood? And another one from Moira Gray, who asks, how serious is a nuclear response from either side?
Yeah, very low is my view. Very low. Because Putin's been talking about nuclear weapons since 2010. He never made a speech without telling everybody Russia was a nuclear power. So he's saber rattled nuclear weapons all the time, and he's done it even more from day one of this crisis. He's done it less recently because both China and India have told him to tone it down, and particularly Xi Jinping in China was getting very nervous about all of this. And they have advised him very strongly to tone it down, which by and large they have. But regardless of the rhetoric, people say, oh, would they resort to a tactical nuclear weapon? Well, again, Ukraine is a big country. Ukrainian forces are really quite well dispersed. To make any difference, let's say that they wanted to attack with a nuclear weapon, say a brigade of Ukrainian troops who were all foolish enough to be in one place, like one town. 5,000 troops. Well, to actually, as it were, kill 2,000 of them and injure the other 3,000 with a nuclear device, you would need a device of about 10 or 12 kilotons. Now, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons, and you'd have to use more than one to have any military effect. So to have any military advantage, the Russians would have to use, let's say, 4 or 5 Hiroshima-style bombs in Ukraine. You don't see it, can't see it at all, because the taboo against using nuclear weapons is very, very strong since 1945. Now that we all know what they do, that taboo will be broken at some point, and whoever breaks it will have the everlasting legacy of history that they were the one who broke the taboo. So my argument is that a single, small tactical nuclear weapon will be irrelevant in this crisis, because of the nature of Ukraine and the nature of its forces, that only, as it were, the biggest strike that you could imagine in present circumstances tactically would make any difference. And would Putin really want that as his legacy? I very much doubt it. So I don't take very seriously the idea of nuclear exchange or nuclear use. What I do take seriously is the possibility of a civil nuclear accident. I mean, the Ukrainians, apart from Chernobyl, they've got 4 big nuclear power plants. They're all powered down at the moment, but the reactors, all of which are down, nevertheless have to be maintained with constant electricity. And the bombing campaign that the Russians are now conducting has cut them off from mainstream electricity a few times, and they depended on generators. But it wouldn't take much to create another Fukushima or even another Chernobyl if this campaign goes on. And that's what I do fear that. And I think there's a realistic chance, which, and I hope I'm wrong, of a civilian nuclear disaster.
Fingers crossed. So Anne Russell asked, why is Chancellor Scholz of Germany insisting that American tanks have to be deployed before they give the green light to using the Leopard tanks.
True, yeah. He's been going from excuse to excuse, Chancellor Scholz, to avoid having to make a decision, which is his preferred posture on anything, is to not make a decision. He can't make a decision on anything, let alone these sort of things. But the idea is if the Americans deploy their main battle tank, the Abrams M1, then that would actually put America in the lead as far as Russian perceptions go. And although, David Petraeus was saying last night that he said, well, if that's what it takes, send a company of M1 tanks. So let's send 12 to 15 tanks, a company's worth, and let them do whatever they do. It'd be very expensive. It would take a lot of, they use fuel. It's got a gas turbine engine. They do, I worked this out a while ago. They do about 500 yards to the gallon. Aviation fuel, five gallons to the mile they take for the gas turbine engines. Anyway, they're very, very thirsty. They're hard to maintain, blah, 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 blah. But send them if that would release the Leopards, because the Leopards, the Ukrainians need 100 or 150 of them. And Chancellor Scholz is trying to actually hide behind the Americans to say, well, if they're prepared to put themselves out in front, I'll stand behind them. But to be honest, even if the Americans now say we'll send a company of M1 Abrams, I suspect that Scholz will look for some other reason to at least delay. And so will Boris Pistorius, who's the new defense minister, who said yesterday, I think Pistorius must have been in a different meeting to everybody else. But he said yesterday that I will now go and we'll audit our stocks of Leopard 2 tanks for the Bundeswehr. So the new defense minister who replaced Christine Lambrecht last week, it takes a new defense minister to go and count the number of tanks they've got. It's beyond comical, to be honest.
Okay, here's one from Ian Neal asking whether if Ukraine were to renounce their intention to join NATO, might that help reduce the tension and contribute to a settlement?
Not now. It might have. And Zelensky, before the invasion, but Zelensky didn't believe the invasion would happen until about 48 hours before, when it was clearly going to happen. But he said, look, there's lots of things we can talk about. We can talk about neutrality. We can talk about the fact that we don't think we'll ever come into NATO. And I was saying at the time, Austrian State Treaty, 1955 Austrian State Treaty was a sort of basis for some discussion, if you wanted a basis, because in 1955, the Russians were in Austria after the end of the Second War. 1955, Austria became formally neutral, and on that basis, the Russians left Austria, and the Austrian constitution was based around the idea of formal neutrality, and that was good enough, and it's worked pretty well by and large. So that could have been a model for something in Ukraine, and that was not unrealistic up to the point of the invasion, and even for a couple of weeks after the invasion had taken place. But now that this is a war, against the people of Ukraine, not just the leadership, against Ukraine, the country, and that the Russians clearly, and Putin absolutely, if you look at what he said, not just in speeches, but in this big article he wrote in July 2021, where he basically said Ukraine is not a country, it has no right to exist. It's intrinsically part of Russia, and historically, you can see why he thinks that. He has a very peculiar view of Russian history, but nevertheless, you could draw that interpretation from it if you want. And for that reason, the idea of Ukraine as we're renouncing any aspiration to join NATO is now irrelevant. I think we've gone past that now.
Thank you, Michael. Jim Robertson says, could we in Britain have been more assertive when Russia occupied Crimea in 2014? Why did we appear to accept the occupation?
Yeah, absolutely right. 2014, the world was Western Europe was outraged, and the Russians carefully calculated the degree of response, and they reckoned that was okay. And they still managed to have a football World Cup, and people went to it, and the whole thing was kept at a diplomatic level. And I know for a fact that the Ministry of Defense in Britain wanted to help the Ukrainians with more military training and more equipment not long after 2014. And the MOD was pushing very hard. Michael Fallon, when he was defense minister, I know for a fact, and I think he said it publicly now, thought this would be a good thing. The Foreign Office in Downing Street wouldn't have it because they worried that it would be misinterpreted by Moscow, would look escalatory. So, most Western European powers actually moderated their opposition to what had happened in 2014. And the Minsk process what became Minsk I and then Minsk II, which was a diplomatic forum led by Germany and France. Britain was not involved, not interested, interestingly, not invited, as far as I know. The Minsk II process was a sort of process of helping the Ukrainians get used to the idea that they'd lost Crimea and they'd lost these areas in the Donbass, and it was all up for future discussion. The Minsk II diplomatic process was a really poor piece of diplomacy, which didn't help anybody. So yes, we now look back to 2014 and say, we ought to have been more active in pushing back on Russia, because Putin gained from the 2014 crisis the fact that as long as he was careful, that he would get away with more or less anything.
So I think this is the penultimate question from Simon Garlick. Why do you assess that the war is going to get worse for Putin?
Because the Western resolve hasn't cracked as he hoped it would, certainly over the winter. Western resolve at the moment is still high, not despite the Leopard 2 tank issue and so on. The economic damage to Russia is long term. Although the Russian economy has still got cash because of oil and gas revenues, and it's still taking in more revenue than aid to Ukraine in monetary terms. Russia is still getting more oil and gas revenue than aid is being sent to Ukraine. That is all still the case. So Russia is still quite cash rich, but its underlying economy is really suffering. Its markets, some of its markets, certainly in the most productive markets, its most valuable markets in the Western world have disappeared more or less and won't come back inside a couple of generations. And I think the war itself will drain Russia, because even if the Ukrainians, as it will, lose in the next 12 months, and the Russians are able to take vast swathes of Ukrainian territory, they'll have to keep fighting for it, because the Ukrainians have indicated that they won't roll over. They won't. And so the best the Russians can hope for is to occupy, as it were, let's say, eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper River, and then suffer a guerrilla war for the next couple of generations while the Ukrainians resist. And that's a miserable situation for any country to be in.
Thank you. So the final question from Karen Luton. Can you offer us a couple of minutes of hope, Michael, before she says she takes to drink? I'm with her.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, yes. This is dangerous. This is a dangerous time for Europe. The peace and prosperity we've had since 1945 is historically unusual. It's historically untypical, and we've got to realize that. And like previous generations, we may have to sacrifice certain things ourselves for our own longer-term peace and prosperity. And it'd be unusual in the last 1,000 years of European history if that was not the case at some point during the next few years. And this may be it. This may be the test. However, up to now, I think there's a growing realization in Western politics that is the test, and that we must rise to it. And if you look at it as it were in broad terms, Russia is on the wrong side of history. It's a dangerous country, or it's a dangerous leadership because it's so assertive and aggressive and it's ruthless and so on. But it's in a very weak position compared to Western Europe, which has 12 times its wealth, is massively more able militarily than Russia. If it ever came to a NATO-Russia war, NATO would walk all over Russia. We don't want to do that. But NATO would not lose in a war against Russia militarily, nor would it lose in a war against Russia economically. The issue is we've tolerated Putin on the assumption that he would just be a bloody nuisance. Now that we know that he's much more than that, there is a sort of coming together, I think, of this consensus that the Western liberal world needs to be defended a bit more actively than before. But it can be done. It can be done. And I suspect that Putin won't be there for too much longer. I cannot predict how he will disappear, but I suspect that as the effects of this war really get into Russia, particularly mobilization, that really affects Russia in ways that, Russian population didn't mind this operation as long as it didn't really affect them day to day, but it is now affecting them day to day in all sorts of ways. And I suspect that this year, even if it goes well for Russia on the battlefield of Ukraine, will go very badly for Russia throughout the country. And I think that Putin's days are numbered. Having said which, he won't be replaced by a nice man. The only thing we're certain of, he will be replaced by a man. He probably won't be a nice man, but the one after that, there'll be a hiatus, as there always is in Russian history. There'll be a hiatus, and the one after that may be somebody that we can get back on terms with and get back to a more sensible relationship with. So I'm in the longer term, 2 to 3 years, I'm quite hopeful that this may be a shot in the arm for Western liberal democracy, as well as our own sense of what it is that we think we represent and our need to do so.
Goodness, well, Michael left us all pretty breathless. So if you have such a grasp of this extremely complex situation, thank you very, very much for giving us your time. We hope your face mends soon.
Yes, me too.
Yes, just stay upright. We need you.
Yeah, thank you.
The next Hexham debate to put in the diaries is the 11th of February, when Chris Beals will be speaking about the housing crisis. So thank you very much, everybody, for logging on, and we hope we'll see you on the 11th of February.